It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. It's also one of those times that I'm recording first thing in the morning, so my voice is a little more gravelly. I don't know, kind of like it, but it's what it is. It's one of the possible downsides of the way I record the show in different segments. So this is right now in this morning, and I'm putting the show together. And I'm going to put it out a little earlier than I expected, just because I have the content and I have the content ready. And later in the show, we are going to interview Ryan Cragun and talk about his updated book or books. And mostly the subject is leaving religion and the state of religion in the United States and how awesome everything looks generally if you're a fan of there being less people in religion, which I am definitely in that category. I just hope we can survive long enough to get to that promised land, dare I say. The Investing Skeptically segment is a quick review of Morningstar 4- and 5-star funds and their process and why it has not only no value, but actually, if you follow it, it might be counterproductive because you think it has benefit. I did have an email, someone asking about how Morningstar rates individual stocks. I have not researched that as much, but I think the logic for how they review and rank 4- and 5-star funds and the horrible results that come out of that should be enough to give you pause to not use their system for individual stock picking, which I don't recommend anyway. So there's that. But the one thing I did want to cover before we get into the other stuff, and the reason I'm putting this show out a few days early, is the debt crisis. I guess it's the debt crisis, where the Republicans want to get something for voting to continue to pay the bills and the debts and the obligations of the United States of America. If I have my research correct, they did this 3 times while Trump was president and made no demands, made no complications, just voted to increase the debt ceiling because it was their guy. The Don was in charge. So no big deal. But now that they don't have full control, they want to hold the American people, the country, hostage for spending less money. And quite frankly, with the economy doing as well as it is, the revenue coming in for the government is better and could be wickedly better if they, along with Trump, didn't do ginormous tax cuts for wealthy people several years ago. So it's the classic Republican play that's been going on for 50, 60 years, maybe. Starving the beast, where they cut revenue so much that the wealthy people can continue to support them. And then they say, look, we don't have enough money to pay the bills, so let's cut services. And of course, famously in the last few weeks, there was some discussion about whether executives that are getting bank assistance or help from the government should have to work for it, because people that get food stamps, which might be $100 to $120 a month, have to prove effort to go work to earn the food stamps so that they can eat. It's one of those things. There's never seems to be a concern or a shortage when buying new jet fighters. But God forbid someone who maybe either can't or is unable to work or can't find a job, God forbid we give them $120 so they can eat for the month. Something I don't want to try to have to figure out, because I've been to the grocery store recently. It's expensive. It's a lot of money for stuff. But the debt crisis. So here's my thing. I have had people contact me, clients and non-clients. They're reading reports that are predicting horrific outcomes. And there's also the other side that maybe they come up with a deal, whatever it is, at the last minute, and the stock market soars as soon as the deal is announced. So the question is, where does Phil think this is going to go, and how do you play it? So my general advice, and this is always true, and it makes it very easy for me to repeat it again now, ignore it. What are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to solve the debt crisis? I mean, if you want to be involved, contact your representatives and your senators, email, call, protest, get a sign, do all those things. But as far as investing, I don't know. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that I can do for you, is to tell you I have no fucking clue in the next days, weeks, or months what's going to happen to the stock market. In the last 100 plus years, we've had World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Watergate, George W. Bush. We've had a war in Iraq. We've had many horrible things. We've had a lot of good things. Well, we've had 9/11. We had January 6th. Many terrible things. Many great things have happened in the last 100 years, of course. Going to the moon. What has happened to the stock market during those events? Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. But in the long run, it makes about 10%. So if you are investing for the long run, it is reasonable to conclude, because it's been true for almost 200 years in the United States of America in particular, that the stock market will continue to go up around 10% per year in the long run. If you're worried about the money that you need for tomorrow or next year, you should not have that money in the stock market. And that is true right before the debt crisis. That is true right after the debt crisis, in case you're listening to this show a little later on. It's also true in a calendar year like 2021, where the market went up 28%. That was the biggest pushback I had from clients, is that when I would call them up and say, let's take 3 or 4% out of the stock market and put it into bonds because you made a lot of money. They'd be like, no, I want to leave it in here while we're going up. Yeah, but someday that ends, and you don't often know. Well, you never know in advance. You only know after it happened. So long-term investments in stocks, if they go down a whole lot or if they go up a whole lot in the next few weeks, few months, next year or two, doesn't materially affect what's going to happen to you in 8, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, if you are so lucky to live many, many years past retirement. The stock market will go on. Companies will make money. Companies will cheat and break the rules. They'll do good things. They'll do horrible things. The laws will change, but companies will make money. What happens in the short term doesn't matter. If you are in a position where you're near retirement or in retirement, you should already, as a listener to the show, you should already be prepared for something terrible to happen in case it does. You should have the cushion built. We've talked about it. We'll continue to talk about it. And one of the nice things I think about my system is that it's the same set of rules whether the market is up or down. Now, like I just said, when the market makes 28% in 1 year, I might be inclined to move a few percent more over to the cushion that I might have that year. If the market falls like it did 19.5% in 2022, for a lot of people, we were a little slower in putting things into the cushion. So if we were going to move 2 or 3 or 4%, maybe we moved 1 or 2%. And for some of those clients, now that the market is up so far in 2023, 8%, give or take what day you look at it. Maybe we moved over another extra 1 or 2%. And we'll see how the year goes. If the rest of this year is down, well, maybe we wait. If the rest of the year goes up 10, 15, 20%, cool. Now we'll put another 3 or 4% in the cushion if they're 10, 12 years or less from retirement. If you're 5 years or less from retirement, your cushion should be pretty much where it's going to need to be in retirement. There are some exceptions. Some people are willing to take more risk. Some people want less risk in general. And that's not to do with current events. That just has to do with them and the volatility they are willing to accept. And then, of course, I have the delightful cases and a few examples where people have a great big fat portfolio in retirement. And the biggest problem they have is me annoying them and telling them to spend more money. You should be so lucky. That's a fantastic place to be in. But it often happens that if you've spent 40 or 50 years saving money, trying to cut corners, and you finally made it, well, how do you change? That's a whole nother segment. Maybe we'll do that coming up. But we don't know what's going to happen. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. You can become involved. Of course, you can always do that. But you're not going to change the debt crisis in the next few days, the next few weeks. What should you do with your investment? Leave it the fuck alone. Now, if you're 2 years from retirement and for whatever reason you're 98% in stocks, you should rebalance your portfolio, not because of the looming debt crisis, but because you're doing it wrong. And that's in my opinion. If you like 98% stocks and that's what you want to do, that's cool. As an extreme example, my parents, mostly my dad, because he was the one who did the investing, was 90% in the stock market even when he passed away at the age of 81, because he knew that he and my mom, his wife, were using far less than they could from the portfolio because their goal was to give it to the 3 boys. Now, we would often talk to them and say, spend more, spend more, spend more. But again, they grew up, they were born in 30 and 36 roughly. And so they'd seen really, really hard times. And they just couldn't change their behavior of 40, 50, 60 years of saving to then turn around and enjoy more of it. But hopefully I can help you, at least some of you, avoid that. But others of you will not spend enough, no matter how much I annoy you. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to hear about Morningstar 4 and 5-star funds, and then we're going to have our fantastic interview with Ryan Cragun. But just one more time, the debt crisis, I do not know what is going to happen, and neither do you. Long run, the stock market makes about 10%. If you're investing for the long run, relax. It might go up, it might go down, but what matters is the long run. If you need money in the short term, 5 years or less, 3 years or less, maybe you should have it in all very short-term bonds or CDs or just cash sitting in your bank. But that's true all of the time, not because of the debt crisis. Breathe, and it's going to be okay. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
I'm not even an atheist. I'm what you might call an anti-theist. I think religion is a bad idea. I think it's a tool used by the powers that be to control the weak-minded in our society. But you can't pour that on a form, so I just write Church of England. I'm actually a lapsed Catholic. Any Catholics in? Oh, quite a few over there, yeah. I'm a lapsed Catholic. I knew my days were over in the Catholic Church when I found myself at communion thinking, I like the wine, I'm loving the wafer. Any chance of a bit of cheese? Don't get me wrong, though, I still respect the Pope. I like to think of the Pope as king of the pedos. He's the best one. He's the ringleader. He's Gary Glitter's boss. Catholics are a weird bunch. Look at the rosary. Basically, anal beads. I saw a documentary recently on Channel 4. It was all about faith. And in it, someone went, well, of course, Scientology is a made-up religion. I thought, as opposed to... It's one of my favourite things is to get Christians talking about Scientology. Because the Christian will go, Scientologists, they're nutters, they believe in aliens. And then you can say to the Christian, what do you believe in again? It's a benevolent zombie that's coming back to save you, isn't it? Good luck with that, that will probably happen.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions. In a previous episode, I had mentioned Morningstar star rating system for mutual funds. And if anyone wanted to know more about it, to send me an email. Well, I did get a couple of emails. One of them was about Morningstar's system for rating individual stocks. I'm not an expert in that, and I don't recommend buying and selling individual stocks. I like to use mutual funds, specifically index mutual funds. And since that's what I talk about all the time, I am going to focus on Morningstar's system for rating funds. I have two sources that I'm going to use here because I've used different sources in the past, and I thought, well, you know what? Let me check to see if other places agree or disagree with the things that I've talked about in the past. And I wish I had all the data at my fingertips and all the time in the world to analyze it and slice it and dice it in different ways, but that's a lot of work. And I don't have a lot of free time, so I'm going to borrow from some other people. So the first place, and a wonderful place to go, you can go to investopedia.com, and the article I'm looking at here is titled, "Is Morningstar's Rating System an Accurate Ranking Tool?" Which is interesting because is it an accurate ranking tool? Well, I think maybe you could say yes, because it ranks. And based on the criteria that it uses, it's accurate. But there's some interesting things in there that we can use to look going forward. And so when I say something, it might have been something that I read out of there. I'll try to be specific, but I may skip something. And another one is a Word document I got from Mission Square Retirement. Mission Square, I'm going to read a little bit from their About page. Founded in 1972 through the assistance of a Ford Foundation grant, Mission Square Retirement's mission is to help public sector employees build retirement security. And so they look at a lot of different things and try to educate people on how to invest. And they issued this document where they looked at, let's see, here's the title of it, "The Elusive Predictive Powers of Star Ratings." And again, this is predictive of what? I think what you can find is that if you look at 4 and 5 star funds, which most people tend to see as a positive indication that they should buy or invest in that fund, or they're okay to invest in that fund, what do they predict? Well, that's curious. And before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm going to go back to Investopedia here. And there's the 5 stars. Actually, you know what? I think it was better laid out in this Mission Square document here. The 5-star funds are the top 10%. The 4-star funds are the next 22.5. The middle, or the 3 stars, are 35%. And the 2-star are 22.5. And the 1-star, again, 1%. So the 1 and 5 stars are 10% each. The 2 and 4 are 22.5% each. And the middle of the 3 stars is 35% each. You can kind of also break this down in thirds, where 1 and 2 stars suck at 33.5. The middle is 35. And the 4 and 5, the ones that are really good, are 33.5 or 32.5 again. So almost thirds there, still with 3 stars being the most frequent. But it's something people will look at. I don't even know the details of how it's calculated. I don't know that they want you to know the details of how it's calculated. But Investopedia has some information on this. Investopedia is referencing some information published in the Wall Street Journal, which is one of those paywall kind of things, so it's hard for me to go get it. They're referring to some research from 2014. Part of this is because I was trying to look for 5-star funds 10 years ago in 2013 and look at how they're doing today, and that proved to be a bit more of a challenge than I was hoping it was going to be. Thank you, not Google. But what the Wall Street Journal did, and this is in Investopedia, the article that I cited, so you can go look it up yourself. The Wall Street Journal went to Morningstar and said, give us a comprehensive list of every single 5-star fund in 2014, and we want to look at how they've done from in 2004, and we want to look at how they've done from 2004 up until the end of the 10-year period in 2014 when this article and data was originally compiled. So here's the deal. 37% of the 5-star funds lost 1 star and were now 4-star funds. 31% lost 2 stars, and they're now 3-star funds. 14% lost 3 stars, and 3% dropped down to 1 star. And only 14%, 58 out of the 403 funds that they started with, only 14% of them maintained the 5 stars. With the more than half had 3 stars or less. So more than half were mediocre to shitty. 2/3 almost were mediocre, because it's 35 plus 32.5. So more than 2/3 were mediocre or crappy. That probably wasn't what you expected when you put the money in. So this is a way, without having the actual performance numbers, to go back to Morningstar itself, kind of using them as a sword against their own strategy. If a 5-star fund is fantastic, is it going to be fantastic in the future? And the data says no. It's not going to be in the top. Matter of fact, 14% stayed 5-star and 37% stayed at 4-star. I guess that's, that might be 51. 51% were above average, or above the middle, I guess, which, considering they were the top 10% to now only half of them being in the top third, is not great, because the other half are in the middle or worse, probably doing far worse than index funds. And when I've looked at this in the past, what happens is even 5-star funds going forward, if they have historically overperformed the index or the standard that they're measured to, going forward, they always underperform. And of course, there's exceptions. The trick is, how did you know out of this 403 funds, which ones of the 58, or the 58 of the 403, how do you know which ones of the 5 stars are the ones to buy and which ones are the ones to avoid? So again, it doesn't provide you anything useful. The other research that I talked about from Mission Square in this document that I found, they were in a similar time period. I think it was, 2015. So this had to be done in 2016 because they went all the way to the end of 2015. And they started with a collection of 4 and 5-star funds. And they started with, was it 297? Yes, 297 4 and 5-star funds. And they have a really beautiful graph to show you what their ratings changed to month by month by month. And not surprising, the number of those funds that stayed 5-star fell. The number of them that were 4 stars fell. The number that were 3 stars grew quite a bit. There ended up being a certain chunk of them going to 2-star, and a small percentage of them became 1-star. But the graph of all of these stars combined gets lower and lower and lower each year. And that is something I have talked about in the past, and it's very wonderfully, expertly displayed in the book, the 4th book of the series of 4 that I recommend that you read, Common Sense on Mutual Funds, because a lot of funds disappear. We actually, just a few episodes back, maybe even the last episode, I talked about funds going away and is Invesco, and they just ended a bunch of funds and ETFs and just gave everybody their money back, which is not the norm. Usually they get blended into something else so they can keep your money. In this project, they started with 297 funds 10 years later. And this is something that always biases the data. You must incorporate this information. 101, 30%, 101 of the 297 funds disappeared. Just fucking disappeared. Now, I think it is safe to say that the vast majority of those funds sucked. Because if you had a winning fund, why would you end it? Maybe you had your reason. Maybe that mutual fund company went broke. Maybe that mutual fund company got bought by another mutual fund company. That would actually be plausible for some of them. But the vast majority of the funds that I've ever looked at over history, they just disappear. And so they're no longer even able to be rated or ranked. And I think they have the breakdown here, 297 funds. Only 52 of them are now rated 4 or 5 stars. So that is one sixth. So a third would be 33. Half of that, 1/6 would be about 16, 17%. Really close to the number that the Wall Street Journal in Investopedia came up with. So after 10 years, even if you pick the best funds based on the Morningstar ratings, what happens over a decade is that they don't perform well. And matter of fact, if only 1/6 of them, oh, this is fascinating. I wish I'd thought of this earlier, it just popped into my head. If 1/6 of the funds are now 4 or 5 star ratings, remember we started with 100% of them were 4 or 5 star. And at any given time period, about 32.5% of mutual funds are 4 or 5 star rated. So you have half of these funds are 4 and half of the amount you would expect just kind of through random assignment of performance of these funds are 4 and 5 stars. So you started with 4 and 5 star only funds. Even if you randomly assign them numbers based on the percentage of funds that get ranked in the Morningstar system, 32.5% of them should be 4 or 5 star funds. But it's only about 16% of them are 4 and 5 star funds after a decade. So less than half, or about half, of what you would expect if there was randomness. And why is that? Well, it's fascinating. Let me see. Conjecture. Things changed, so the market is different. So what made funds look really successful in 2006 changed a whole lot in 2008, I bet you. And so when things change, just like we had in 2022, value kicked growth's ass, even though for the preceding, well, most of the preceding 5, 6, 10 years, growth had done far better than value. Sometimes things change. And so whenever you're looking at Morningstar's star rating system, you're looking backwards in time. So this is why I often say, kind of casually, flippantly, that these star ratings are not only not useful, I think they are genuinely counterproductive, because in this example, in both examples, the data set from the New York Times in Wikipedia and this Mission Square retirement, both of them, the 4 and 5 star funds, actually did worse than average. So, well, that's what I would expect, because the average mutual fund underperforms the market by about 2%, or underperforms its target index by 2 to 3%. So if they're trying to match large cap growth, they don't. If they're trying to match the S&P 500, they don't. If they're trying to match the total stock market index, they don't. And you might think, well, maybe that's not their objective. Okay, some stock mutual funds might have as their objective to dramatically reduce volatility, or be tax efficient, or to have high yield or low yield. But you can pull out different measures and metrics and test them, and it works every time. There might be exceptions to that, but they go away. So this is why I use index funds, because every other thing that has been found, tried, studied to beat the market doesn't beat the market going forward. And this is the same problem with back-tested data. If you come up with a trading schema and you apply it backwards through history and you find out that it made great performance, it doesn't do it going forward. If you found a scheme, a strategy, a methodology to beat everybody else, well, the funny thing is, as soon as that's public knowledge and other people do it, it will also not even work, even if it had actually worked. One of the things that people used to do was a very trendy thing was called the dogs of the Dow. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, in case you didn't know, it is only about 30 stocks. It's a very small sample of the very large growth companies in the United States of America. And the idea was to buy 5 or 10 of the worst performing stocks or different variants of the dogs of the Dow strategy. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details because it doesn't really matter. But what would happen is at the very end of the year, December 30th, December 31st, January 2nd, whenever you could, whatever the trading day was, you would follow this rule and sell a couple of the stocks that you owned and replace them with a couple stocks that now met the criteria, because some of the stocks change and they don't meet the criteria. So every year you would make an adjustment. And someone went backwards through the data and found out that this worked and set up this process and told people, and it worked. It actually did work year after year after year for several years. But what would happen is now some other people would say, hey, wait a minute. I can tell you on December 15th which stocks no longer meet the criteria and which ones will meet the criteria new to be bought. And so they will short the stocks that are going to be sold, and they will buy long the stocks that are going to be bought. Because if 2 or 3 or 5% of all investors now are following this program and they're going to buy and sell on December 30th or December 29th or January 2nd, if I can invest in front of them, knowing that they're going to do this, now I make the money and they don't. And then, of course, someone says, hey, if there's a bunch of people doing this on December 15th, maybe I can do it on December 2nd or November 15th or whatever. And so what happened after several years of success and maybe self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing, it didn't work anymore. Because once enough people figured out that it worked, it won't work going forward because people undermine it, or it just never really worked and it was just an interesting variance in the data that doesn't continue going forward. So there's always things that change. And so again, the index strategy is to not try to beat the market. You just own everything. You just own everything. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up too much. No one ever seems to be bothered by that. It goes down too much. Sometimes people are very concerned about that. But the strategy is to ignore all of that and go forward on the 150 years, 200 kind of sketchy data back then. But particularly for the United States, the markets go up because companies create value. We've talked about this before. They take inputs and the end result is something that's more valuable than all of the pieces that went into it. It creates money. It creates value. This is something that commodities in and of themselves do not do. An ounce of gold is an ounce of gold. If you use it to build something, hopefully that something is worth more than the gold that they put into it. But if you're just holding the commodity, you don't enjoy any of that. And it's the same thing with all crypto. It doesn't do anything. It sits there. And of course, all of the schemes in the last couple of years where you could invest your crypto in some crypto brokerage firm and make 8, 10, 20, 50% yield, people actually did that. They thought that was a thing, that made sense, that they could do that. It just doesn't work. Anyway, so that's some thoughts on Morningstar star rating system and how it will not help you beat average performance. It will actually make it harder for you to beat average performance because the funds that get 4 and 5 star rated in the future don't maintain those ratings, which I think is a very strong indication from Morningstar's own system that they are no longer doing what you thought they were doing when they were 4 and 5 star. Anywho, enough of that. Let's go on to something actually fun.
This is atheism in a nutshell. You say, there's a God. I say, can you prove that? You say no. I say, I don't believe you then. Mm-hmm. So, you believe in one God, I assume?
In 3 persons, but go ahead.
Okay, so you believe... Okay. Mm-hmm. So, but there are about 3,000 to choose from that have been, people who believe in...
I've done some reading, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So basically, you deny one less God than I do. You don't believe in 2,999 gods, and I don't believe in just one more.
Right.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Welcome back, everybody. Today I have Ryan Cragun. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing really well. Yeah, it's a great day.
Indeed it is. We're going to focus on the brand new book that I didn't even know was coming out, and I happened to message you just the other day on the day that the book became public. So listeners, this may be the first you hear about this book. It's called Beyond Doubt. And then the rest of the title, The Secularization of Society. It's Secular Studies book number 7. We'll get into that. But before we do that, of course,
sure.
You have other books, right?
I do. I don't keep track anymore, so I couldn't tell you exactly which number this is. But it's more than 5. Let's put it that way. I have like more than 5.
Yeah.
Something around there.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And we have How to Defeat Religion.
Yeah.
And What You Don't Know About Religion.
What You Don't Know About Religion.
Yeah. And a book on sociology. That looks like a textbook kind of thing. No.
Yeah, so a couple of them are edited volumes. So there's one that is my other interest, the Palgrave Handbook of Global Mormonism. And then there is one that might be of interest to your readers, even though it's pretty academic. It's called Organized Secularism in the United States.
Nice.
That one's a fun one, too. That's actually pretty interesting.
Nice. Well, this newest book is a collaboration, right, with a couple of authors. And
yeah, that's Isabella Casselstrand and Phil Zuckerman.
Excellent. I just wanted to make sure we give them a little credit for being involved. But well written. I read the first 50 pages in detail, and then I had to start going to skimming mode because I only got the copy from you. Thank you. Last night. Mm-hmm. So I think I've done pretty good to be able to read 50 and skim all the way through it and pick up. This is the book that most of my listeners need. And I'll explain that in details, but before I take away too much of the conversation, tell us about the book Beyond Doubt, how it came about, what it is, what am I going to get out of it? Tell us more.
Sure. So I don't want to claim credit for the original idea because it's not entirely mine, but I had an idea for a book similar to this that I ran by Phil Zuckerman actually on the island of Lesbos, 6 or 7 years ago. And we got talking about it, and it just kind of fell through the cracks. And then Isabella reached out to Phil and said she wanted to do a book on secularization that was, again, pretty related to this topic. He looped me in, and then we started working on it. And the basic idea behind the book, and we talk about this in that very first chapter, is that for running through the 1980s and 90s, all the way up to the early 2000s, in the sociology of religion, so this is a bit of a sociology of religion book, there was a pushback in the U.S. in particular against the idea that society was secularizing. And what we mean by secularization is kind of the decline of religion in society. We could see that pattern happening in lots of other countries around the world already. particularly Western Europe, but Australia, New Zealand, a bunch of other places too. But in the U.S., it seemed like the U.S. wasn't really secularizing. That started to change in the 1990s. Like it started to become very observable, like, oh, something's actually happening. But U.S. sociologists, not all of them, but some started to push back hard on this and say, no, the U.S. is an exception. Secularization isn't happening. Secularization isn't real. One of the big names in the field, Rodney Stark, who passed away 6 months ago, he was a big advocate of like secularization is not happening. He actually kind of wrote a whole bunch about how this is not happening. And then the evidence just became overwhelming. I mean, today we have lots of survey data going back to the 1980s that's repeated measures over time. It's so clear that secularization is happening, especially in the U.S., and we can talk about specific numbers, that Phil, Isabel, and I said, you know what we need to do is just write the definitive book on secularization. We can talk about the theory piece here that says it's happening, stop denying it. And that's the origins of this book. And that's basically the argument that we make throughout the book is it is impossible to deny the evidence that secularization is happening around the world today.
I was actually kind of surprised as I read the introduction to give, this history of where you're coming from. I had no idea that there was a serious, contingent in psychology or sociology that thought religion wasn't fading in the United States. I maybe it's because I'm biased. We all are, I guess, to some point, but because of what I do and how long I've seen it, and maybe I wasn't looking at this in the 80s, and maybe you could come to a different conclusion. And I'm looking at this 90s and beyond, and I think it's comically easy to see. The only thing that makes it a little bit weird for the average citizen is that the people that are religious or claim to be religious have an outsized amount of power. Does that seem fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. It was actually really shocking. I mean, we don't go into all these details, but I've been involved in this field for over 20 years now. That same Rodney Stark, as late as around 2011, was still denying the increase in the non-religious, those who say they have no religious affiliation. That was just blatant at that point. So to give, again, some numbers for listeners, in 1990 in the U.S., about 7% of U.S. adults said they had no religious affiliation. By 2001, it had doubled. It was 14%. By 2008, it was closing in on 20 to 21%. And at that point, Rodney Stark was still saying, it's not happening. There is no secularization happening in the U.S. As of today, we're closing in on 30%. So it's close to 30% of the U.S. population reports no religious affiliation. And that's just one measure of religiosity.
Yes.
We can talk about behaviors and beliefs,
but
it's pretty clear.
And I do want to talk about those. But before we put the cart before the horse kind of thing, as you did in the book, which really helps, it's a very, very reasonable flow of the information. And one of the things that you did very early on, and there's this wonderful graphic, I have it here as page 37, the flow chart to and towards secularization, to kind of clearly articulate to the reader or the listener, if you ever get a podcast, an audiobook version, what is it you're talking about? What is secularization? And before we dig into that too much, how does a society secularize? What are the things that you guys propose are the main features and causes of this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So secularization, we break it down that there are basically two ways to think about this. So one is the observable process, right? And you can actually, one of my colleagues made me take it out of the book, but we tried to make the comparison to evolution, actually, right? Yeah. You can observe evolution, like you can literally see it.
Yes.
Easiest way is with bacteria, right? But then there's also the theory behind it. So what is causing it? And those are really kind of different in evolution. It's the same general idea, but they're different. Same with secularization. So secularization, you can observe declining levels of religiosity, the differentiation of religiosity from other aspects of society. All of this is observable. You can literally see it. You can see it in the numbers. But then the second part of that is the theory. So the theory is what is causing the decline of religiosity, the decline of religious authority in society, the decline of pervasiveness of religion and its power. And that you mentioned on page 37, we develop basically a model, right? So it's a visual model or representation of what we think is causing this. The primary cause is really modernization. That's what we call it. And modernization is kind of moving towards more egalitarian views, towards modern ways of thinking, more rational ways of thinking. And I'm happy to explain what I mean by that, because most people are not rational. So we're not actually trying to make that argument. But it is really at heart modernization. And I can give a really quick example. It's the example I give in my classes to help my students understand this.
Do it.
When I'm talking about modernization, I basically will ask my students, I'll say, okay, how many of you drive a car, right? And almost all of them will raise their hands. And I say, okay, how many of you understand how an internal combustion engine works? Or maybe an electric car, right? And most of the hands go down. There's usually one or two who are like, I took apart a car with my dad or something. And I'm like, okay, so they kind of get it, but they don't fully understand it. I say, okay, so you drive a car, you don't really know how it works, but if your car were to break down, how many of you would take it to a priest to have him bless it, right? How many of you would cut the head off a chicken and sprinkle the blood on there to try and fix your car? And they all laugh, and they're like, that's so absurd, that's ridiculous. And I say, and that's exactly what I mean by modern ways of thinking, by modernization. You don't know how a car works, but you know somebody does. You're going to take your car to a mechanic, and they're going to fix it. Cars don't work on magic. They don't work on divine power or supernatural power. It's basically, it's engineering, it's technology, it's science. And just knowing that somebody knows how it works is modernization. So it's modern ways of thinking that are leading to the decline of religiosity around the world. I don't know if that helps, but that's usually the example.
No, I love it, and it's curious to me. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, and the argument I would make probably 30 years ago when someone would explain to me the power of prayer, particularly in relationship to medical healing. You don't necessarily need to go to the doctor. You need prayer, which goes way back to, ancient times when we didn't have any other option. So prayer was about as good as it's going to get, maybe leeches, right? And they were explaining this to me. And, I know of the historical studies and more modern studies on how prayer doesn't work in a medical setting beyond that of a placebo. But what I would retort back is that if you want me to think that you actually believe in the power of prayer, show to me along the side of the road a group of people, holding hands and praying that the flat tire will inflate itself. Because we all know that's ridiculous. The tire is not going to fix itself. Even if it's a small leak, God's impotent. He can't do anything. And they're like, well, that's different. I'm like, well, how is that different? The thing is that there you can tangibly and very easily see the prayers aren't working, but sometimes sick people get better. And then you attribute it. But it's pointed out in the book, you had the great example, as more and more of our life becomes things that are fixed by another human, because there's really no other choice. If your phone screen breaks, you can't pray and get it to be repaired. When your car doesn't work, prayer doesn't work. All these things, but we're still left with medicine. But as more and more parts of society become clearly that they function extant, is that the right word? Extant religion, without religion, that you have more and more people that just don't need religion, and it just fades away. Does that seem like a reasonable sum up?
Yeah, that's a very good summary of the argument that we're making, is people just increasingly don't need it. It just is not relevant to their lives. One of the specific examples we give in the book is somebody who has fertility issues, right? You could pray to a patron saint for fertility, or you could go to a doctor and actually get tested and see what the problem is. And increasingly, this is the example we give when we're talking about rationalization. It's not that people are rational per se. It's that we increasingly move towards using methods and approaches that work, right? They're demonstrably more effective than, say, praying to the patron saint for fertility, right? So that's the general idea. Yeah, we tend to move towards methods that actually seem to be effective in general, and as a result, we don't need religion. Religion just becomes superfluous.
Absolutely. And under this rationalization category, and again, not that people do or don't think rationally, that's a whole nother book, I'm sure. You have the functionality of the world, the modern world, with economic development becomes, there's really no place left for a deity. It doesn't even make sense. But two topics, and I would love for you to mention both of them, or at least give an example if you can, because I know I'm asking a lot, but it just came out, so hopefully you can do it. You mentioned childhood autonomy and existential security, which I hadn't thought about the childhood autonomy, but that's kind of a no-brainer. Maybe that's why I didn't even think about it.
Right.
But the existential security, I've thought about for many years. What is that?
Sure. So this idea, it's not original with us. So we're actually drawing on Ronald Inglehart and Pippin Norris, two social scientists who proposed this all the way back in 2001. But the basic idea is humans have existential needs, right? We want to feel secure at some level. So we want to feel like, our needs are met and like we don't have to turn to other sources to kind of be taken care of. When we lack existential security, when we don't know if we're going to have enough food, if we don't know if we're going to have health care, if we don't know if we're going to have money, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. And for many people, the way that they assuage that uncertainty is they turn to the divine. So if you can increase people's existential security, then basically, in effect, what you end up doing is removing their reliance upon religion. The clearest example of this is what we call social safety nets in societies, right?
Yeah.
So in your highly developed Scandinavian countries, for instance, or your Northern European countries that have really well-developed social safety nets, you lose your job, you're not going to lose your house, you're not going to lose your food, right? Like that, you're going to continue to survive. And it's in those societies where we see the need for or desire for religion just completely like bottoming out. Just no one's interested in religion anymore. So what they propose there is that in societies where you have widespread existential security, the need for religion, I shouldn't say need, the desire for religion, right, to assuage these concerns just disappears. It's not needed. And what made their argument particularly compelling is when they were writing that in 2001, the U.S. did stand out as being more religious than most other highly developed countries.
Right.
We also have one of the worst social safety nets of highly developed countries. So their argument fit the data really, really well, and that's why most of us have continued to say, yeah, that makes sense, right? There's a lot of utility behind that argument.
Well, I think if you live in a culture or a subculture within the United States where your next meal is in doubt, the idea of giving a big chunk of your money to a religion or a church or a religious leader seems as good as anything else because you're not getting anything. And you're perpetually at risk for your job, your safety, your home, your food. If those things are removed, and actually the limited things that we have in this country compared to many other modern countries, there is an entire political party, and I don't know if you need to address it. I'll say it out loud. Republicans want to take away things that we already have. And is that just coincidence, or do religious leaders know they're dying out and it's going to be a problem if services are provided? Not really in the book, but what do you think?
I've actually addressed this in some of my other writings, and I try to remain largely apolitical, right? In particularly in this, right? My arguments are really about religion, but there is some evidence. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming, but there is some evidence that conservatives in the U.S. Generally, right, political conservatives and religious conservatives have worked together to try to remove that social safety net, in part because they know that it damages the desire for religion. So there is some evidence of this. I don't want to make it out as like it's absolutely clear and compelling and that this is driving the whole Republican Party and that's their platform. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
I think there are some clergy out there who are like, wow, the evidence is pretty clear. And I don't know if your listeners know this, right? But a lot of religions in the U.S. actually hire religious social scientists. Okay, so they hire people trained with the same training I have, who go to the same conferences I go to, who read the same literature that I read. They know the same stuff that I know. They know about existential security. There is no question that the religions in the U.S. know this. To what extent they're actually trying to change policies to make it so people are more dependent upon religion to assuage their existential concerns, I can't definitively say that.
Yeah, it's
but
like
the religions know this.
it's like everything. It's a little more nuanced, a little more complicated. That's why you can write an entire
Right.
book on this hotly debated topic. And there's some things I think are still should be hotly debated, but there's other things that just are wrong, and we need to move on. You talked about childhood autonomy. I think that's pretty straightforward because of the words, but give us a little fill in, and I'll go on to the next one.
Yeah, so we treat this as basically one of the key mechanisms that leads to secularization. And the basic idea is, at least as early as the 1960s, maybe it was earlier than that, but there's pretty compelling evidence that that's when the shift really happened. We had a transition in parenting where parents increasingly said, you know what, I'm not going to force my kids to do everything that I want them to do. I'm going to encourage, instead of just sheer obedience, creativity and kind of, that they're good and moral kids in other ways. And what that led to was an increase in parents giving their kids a degree of autonomy. They could make decisions about some of the things they got to do. And eventually that translated into autonomy over religion. So your listeners are probably aware of this. This is not, shocking news, but the primary way that people become religious is they're raised religious. Not many people convert from not having any religion to joining religion.
Right.
Non-religion is pretty sticky in that sense, right? People stay non-religious. So the primary way that people become religious is through being raised religious. Well, if you're a religious person, you have kids, but then you give your kids some autonomy over whether or not they have to go to church, whether or not they have to believe in God or a higher power or whatever deity you tend to espouse, right? Whether they have to read scriptures, whether they have to do all of these other things. It turns out Fortnite is far more entertaining for kids than reading the Bible, right? Kids are going to choose to do things that are not religious.
I think
what happens.
Watching clouds overhead from a small green hill is way better than reading the Bible. But yes, point taken. So if kids, and of course, that kind of segues into the next one. And if you want to circle back to anything I've brought up, feel free to do so. But the religious pluralism you have out as a separate thing, and I think it stands on its own, but it's also in that autonomy with the children, whether they're little children or high school or young adults, if they're exposed to multiple religion, multiple philosophies, it becomes harder and harder for them to think that I have the one and only true way. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, so that argument actually stems back to the 1960s. It was first proposed by Peter Berger. And it's a tricky argument. So, you've mentioned a lot of these things are actually really nuanced. And why the idea that, there are lots of religions in a particular society and that can lead to the decline of religiosity. Why it's a little nuanced is because humans are pretty, the evidence is pretty compelling at this point. We're innately homophilic. We like to be with people like us, okay? So we tend to congregate with people who are just like us. And as a result, even if you live in a country like the U.S., where there is a lot of religious diversity, right? So we have lots of different religions and increasingly non-religion, people are really good at self-selecting into groups that look just like them. And we call that homophily, right? So that's the sociological term for it, homophily. So as a result, you can actually have, and we give these examples, like a Pentecostal enclave, or, even better, like an Orthodox Jewish enclave in New York City, where there's literally millions of other people with very different beliefs, and then this enclave where they try not to talk to anybody other than other Orthodox Jewish individuals, right? So in order for there to truly be religious pluralism and to see the effect of that on declining religiosity, you actually have to kind of go to public schools. You have to go places where people are different from you and develop relationships with them. And as soon as you start doing this, right, as soon as you open it up to oh, I have friends who are Catholic, I have friends who are Muslim, and I have friends who are atheists, then it becomes really hard, if whatever your religious view is, to be oh, they're all bad people. They're all going to hell because they don't agree with my particular version of Christianity or, whatever religion it is. So as long as you have that kind of pluralism, you've got social connections with people who are not like you, it becomes really hard, as you said, to be I have the truth, everybody else is wrong. And that's the argument that is made, and we actually see that. The empirical data suggests people who do have more connections with people who are not like them are much less kind of strict fundamentalist conservative in their views.
Absolutely. And all of that and even more, of course, all detailed in the book. You can go buy it today, listeners. Beyond Doubt, The Secularization of Society. All of that leads to secularization. What does that actually mean? And then, of course, just like in the book, then I'm going to start wanting some data, and we're going to have fun with that.
Yeah. So there are lots of different ways that you can measure secularization. At heart, we refer to this as kind of the declining authority and influence of religion in society and pervasiveness of religion. But we tend to measure that, again, on multiple dimensions. So there's how people identify. We call that identification, right, or belonging is the way we refer to it in the book. But then there's also what people believe. So do they believe in a God or heaven or hell, or that the Bible is the literal word of God? And then we also have what they do. Do they donate money? Do they go to religious services? You have to measure those separately because people can be very religious in one way and not at all religious in another way. So we call that the multidimensional nature of religion. And in the book, of course, we tackle all three of those. So we have entire sections on belief, behavior, and belonging in all these different countries.
And all those countries, we'll get to if we need to, but most of my listeners are in the United States. Is this happening in the United States, or are we, as a population, as religious as we were 50 years ago?
Great question. Yeah. Thank you for lobbing that softball to me.
I'm here to help.
We are not even close to as religious as we were 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think I mentioned earlier the statistics on just belonging or affiliation. We're closing in on 30% of the population saying they have no religious affiliation. So that, even 30 years ago, that was about 7%. So it's more than tripled during that time. And I like to mention, it's weird to say, but it's the fastest growing quote unquote religion in the U.S. It's not a religion.
Right.
But it is, right? None of the others are growing even remotely that fast. In fact, almost every single other religious group is declining. The one exception are mega churches, which they're basically polling the people who are leaving the other religions. So, but then if we look at attendance or other measures of behavior, and if we look at measures of belief, both of those are on the decline as well. So we'll use just a couple of standard ones. Belief in God. These numbers get really weird really quickly, just because it gets into a lot of nuance in how you measure this. Standard measures for belief in God allow for multiple options. It's not just a Pew. I don't mean to be mean to Pew, right? I actually know the people at Pew really well.
Right.
Their measure for belief in God is a dummy variable, right? Which means it's just an either or. Do you believe in God or a higher power or not? It's a yes, no. Then if you say yes, then they ask you how confident you are in that belief. But other measures like the General Social Survey, which is the survey I tend to use, actually gives people 6 response options, which for the question about belief in God, which is which of the following best describes your belief in a God or higher power. And the first one is I don't believe in a God or higher power. That would be our atheist category. Then you have I don't believe there's a way to find out, which would be our agnostic category. Then you have I believe in a higher power, and then there are 2 that I call soft agnosticism, which is I believe but doubt and I believe sometimes. And then we have the final one, which is I believe without any doubts. Okay?
Yeah.
And here's the weird part, and this is why I'm saying it's a little nuanced. If you kind of pay attention to popular media, it depends on the media today, sometimes you'll hear more than 90% of Americans believe in a God. Well, what those people have done is they've basically taken everybody except the atheist and said they're all believers, right?
Yeah.
And that's not really a reflection of what's actually happening. If you break those categories out, the theistic position, which is that very far end one, which says, I believe in God without any doubts, that's now right around 50%. It's just under 50%. So if you break it out a different way and say, okay, how many people say, I believe in a personal God like the Judeo-Christian God? It's 50% of Americans today. That's a far cry from 90%, which is what you get in a lot of media stories.
Right.
So if we go back and we can see that shift over time, right? The number of atheists has increased. The proportion of the American population that's atheist has increased. The best estimates of that are pretty wildly disparate. People don't want to admit they're atheists. So it's a little bit complicated. At a minimum, there are 3 to 5% of the U.S. population that are atheists. That's gone up by basically it's more than tripled over time. But why I say that's really disparate, different ways of capturing that end up coming up with estimates that are as high as 20 to 30%.
Yeah, I'm in that
I wouldn't
camp.
say that it's quite that high.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it could be that high, right? So I don't want to definitively say like, oh, it's 30% of Americans are atheists, but it's probably more than the 3 to 5% at the low end.
Right.
We just don't get perfect numbers. And then we've got, our agnostics, which they're anywhere from like 6 to 12%. Higher power is pretty high. And then you kind of the balance are the people who say, yeah, I believe, but I doubt, like I'm not confident. So what we've seen is that confidence in belief in God, the theistic position, right, that number has been declining over the last 60 years. So we know that, right? So belief in God is declining. Other beliefs, the literal interpretation of the Bible has also been declining, so we can see that. And then if we turn to behavior, the easiest one to look at is attendance. So how frequently do you attend religious services? That one is also declining. So the number of people who say they never go to religious services is on a pretty dramatic increase. So people rarely, if ever, go to religious services. And the number of people who say they go regularly has actually been declining, though if you want the nuance here, it's actually kind of fun. I like to mention this. If you still ask on surveys how often you attend religious services, it used to be around 45% said every week. Now that's down to about 35%. But we know that many of those people are actually lying.
Well, I was just going to segue into self-reported activities.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people do or do not know it has to do with religion, or it's just collecting large groups of data. But when people have to keep a journal and a log, and that would include going to church on Sunday, what percentage of people in that kind of research are really literally going almost every Sunday?
Yeah. So I'm not going to scoop myself for my next book. I have another book that is under contract with NYU Press that we're almost done with. We dig into that in detail in that book. So I'm just going to cite one study from about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
This is 20 years old. But when we do what is called time diary studies, right? So what you just described, where you make people write down everything they're doing, the percentage of Americans who are actually attending religious services on Sundays is around 20%, or at least it was 20 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of people basically, they have a response bias, right? They respond in a way that they think makes them look better when in fact they're not actually attending all that much. And I love to point out that one of the first people to realize this was one of those he was a sociologist, right? C. Cragun, who actually worked for a church. He worked for a large denomination in the U.S., and he's like, these numbers just can't be real, because if we had that high of attendance, we'd need double the churches that we have. So he started to dig into it, and he was the first one to be like, yeah, there's totally a response bias that's almost double are saying they're going than are actually going.
Yeah, I had spent some time on a Missouri Synod Lutheran Church board years ago. I won't bore you with the details. Listeners may know, but when they would say that there's, and in this one church, say 800 to 900 members, and you show up and you count the number of people that show up for both of the Sunday services, and you get a number like 250, and you're like, so on average, 1/3 to 1/4 of the people are there. And if you go regularly, you see that it's often mostly the same people. So even the people that are theoretically members of that congregation, 75% of them aren't there on a regular basis. So when 40% of the population says they're going weekly, I look at that and I go, I might be a different area than from where I'm from, but that's not what I'm seeing.
No, it's pretty universal now. We know that attendance is probably below 20% on a roughly weekly basis.
Now,
that's high for developed countries.
It was in the book, and I think it might even have been you. You occasionally go to churches, and I think it was you that was. It was a Southern Baptist church that had dwindling membership.
Yeah, so I do. I try to go to religious services. It's always kind of awkward to say it this way, but it's kind of like a biologist going to the zoo, right? Like I'm going to study people.
Yeah. You're an anthropologist.
So I do go once or twice a year. Yeah. And it is interesting. So this one happens to be like less than a mile from my house, and I've lived in the same house for over 15 years now, and I never had gone to this particular church. I've gone to lots of other ones here in Tampa. I'm in Tampa, Florida, but I hadn't gone to this one, and I was like, I'm just going to go. Like, I'm just interested. And on that particular Sunday, it was just total fluke, right? Like, absolute coincidence here. I walk in, and I'm trying to find, like, a pastor. There are actually multiple different congregations meeting there. There's, like, a Haitian group, and then there's a Spanish-speaking group. But the ones who actually owned the property, I finally, find the pastor. He's this middle-aged white guy. And I end up, having, like, a 20-minute interview with him just on chance, right, before the service begins. And that's when he proceeds to tell me that day that I was there, they were going to discuss when they were closing the church. Not if they were closing, when. And this was like in October. They were debating whether they were going to close the church after the Christmas service or after the Easter service, but those were the two options. And then I actually went to the service, and I think the number, I could be getting this wrong, it's in the book. I take notes, right?
Yeah.
I think it was 9 elderly women who showed up to the service. 2 of them came in with walkers, right? The youngest one there was over 70 years old. And then there was one other middle-aged man who showed up, and I had a chance to talk to him a little bit. But basically, the service consisted of 10 people in the audience, if you include me, 11, right? And the middle-aged pastor. And as soon as the service ended, I left because they were going to have a discussion about when they were closing the church.
Right.
That's what's happening with churches in the U.S. today. They're closing, to the tune of thousands a year.
I happen to have a friend who is involved at upper levels of a synod, I guess is what they call it, of the Anglican Church. That's the British.
Episcopalian.
Thank you. Episcopalian.
Yep.
And he had indicated to me that in rural Illinois and Missouri and Indiana, in the areas that they look at least one half of their churches will need to be closed in the next decade because they can't get a minister. It's often a lay minister, and they don't even show up, and the congregations are a fraction, a third, or a fourth of what they used to be, and there's nobody young coming in, and the writing's on the wall. And I was just like, half? And he's like, yeah, half in 10 years will be gone, closed.
Yeah.
And
it's pretty clear. Yeah, the numbers are pretty clear.
And I think without some kind of material change, I think these numbers are going to get better, or from a Christian's perspective, they're going to get worse because of the inherent bias in the groups. Because while everybody in America is becoming slightly to considerably less religious, the young people, which, it's baked into the cake, and we're talking about 40, 45, 50% non-religious. They just don't go to church. They don't buy this stuff. And odds are they're going to live longer than the 60-year-olds and the 70-year-olds. So the numbers are going to continue to shift without abatement for at least one, if not 2 generations. Now, that's me thinking. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're absolutely correct, right? So I mentioned earlier, non-religion tends to be, at least today, stickier than religion. And all I mean by that is, if once you go non-religious, you're less likely to go back.
Yeah.
The religious are having a really hard time retaining their young people. Really, really hard time. And, once people can kind of switch out and once they exit religion, they're done. They just have no interest in this. So you can think about it as compounding. It's almost like compounding interest, right? So not only is it almost a coin toss today whether people under the age of 30 are religious or not, so literally it's like a 50-50, they're going to eventually have kids. Guess how they're going to raise their kids? So their kids are going to be non-religious, right? So it's just an aggregation over time. There is a study just recently published by Pew, I want to say in the last year, where they were projecting the population, the religious population out, and looking particularly at the non-religious.
Yes.
I would say their projections are a little bit conservative.
That's what
They're trying to be a little conservative.
That's what I thought. They were They were holding out hope.
Yes. But again, they're trying to be, very reasonable with their projections. Even their lowest projection, which said if no one switched religion ever again for the next 30 years, you'd still see an uptick in the non-religious just because of kind of inertia. But they're projecting an increase in the non-religious over the next 30 years. So it's happening. It's going to continue to happen. And unless there's some dramatic change, which we talk about in the book, right? The book does have a lot of theory in there and says, here are some things that could reverse this. So we do talk about that, but none of that is on the horizon at this point. So,
and of course, this is not just a U.S. thing. And if anything, the United States is the laggard for the modern world, for the advanced world, the wealthy nations. But many other countries around the world are moving towards less religion. There's always, counter examples and exceptions, but it does seem like the entire planet, is that fair to say, is moving towards less religion? Well,
so we do get into some of this nuance in the book, right? And it gets a little tricky. There are two things that have to happen for secularization to occur. You have to have freedom of or from religion, and you have to have modernization. If you don't have both of those, then all bets are off, okay? And the reason for that, right? So we can look at any predominantly Muslim country that's like a theocracy, right? Where Islam is built right into the constitution of the country. In a lot of those countries, leaving Islam is punishable by death, right? And we actually give examples in the book. I think it's Mauritania, where I literally had to dig in and translate their Arabic constitution and find the passage. But I did. I found the passage that said, if you leave Islam, you have like 3 days to repent. Otherwise, your property is confiscated and you'll be put to death. People aren't leaving religion in those countries in the same way that we see in, say, Scotland, right?
Yeah.
For pretty obvious reasons. They don't want to die.
Yeah.
But when people are actually, if you're able to go into those countries, which they have internet, they have TV, they're aware of what's going on. If you can go into those countries and do anonymous surveys, we mentioned one in Iran, it turns out lots of people are not believers. They don't go. They're not interested in religion anymore. They just can't admit it publicly or they'll be put to death. So it's tricky, right? This is the nuance that we're talking about. If you don't have freedom of religion, you can't really get people openly admitting that they're leaving religion or that they're not interested in religion anymore because they could die. So that gets a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have countries that are not modernizing nearly as fast as other countries. So if you're living in a less developed country or a less developed part of a country, I mean, you already mentioned this, right? There are parts of the U.S. where people are struggling to find their next meal. They're not focused on like, let's cerebrally think about whether there's a God or not. Like that's just not even on the horizon for them. They've got other things that are taking up all of their time, and that's trying to find their next meal. So you've got to have both modernization and freedom of or from religion. Once you have those, all the evidence seems to suggest that they're secularizing. So if you look at every country around the world, that tends to be the pattern.
Absolutely. And of course, one last time for me to mention it, Beyond Doubt is the book, The Secularization of Society. And we've been going a long time, but I'm having great fun with it. So hopefully the listeners are having great fun with it. Mm-hmm. But is there anything that you want to bring up that we haven't mentioned about your work, current work, future work? It's open mic. What do you got?
Sure. There is. So there are a couple of chapters in the book that are pretty theory-based. Readers may not love those. Maybe they will. I don't know. They're very much intended for that sociological kind of debate. But I do want to mention one other chapter in there that is also a little bit theory-driven, but it's very intentional that we put that in. And that chapter addresses the question of whether there is actually an innate need or desire for people to be religious. The primary author on that one, right? So we kind of split up the chapters, was Phil Zuckerman, who I think did a really good job on this. But, and this, you kind of mentioned this right at the beginning of the podcast before we jumped on. This is us kind of punching up, right?
Yeah.
So there are a number of like endowed chairs, right? Like esteemed professors at different universities, ones at Notre Dame, other different places, right? So they've got like endowed chair positions who have basically made the claim that people are innately religious. And to being not religious, one person actually compares to crab walking backwards or repeatedly hitting yourself in the head with a sharp rock.
Yeah,
that's the level of rhetoric that you get among some of these religious social scientists, right? I'm a social scientist of religion. I'm not a religious social scientist. Many of them are religious social scientists, and they make this claim that like people are innately religious. And that chapter really does just completely destroy that argument at so many levels. You told me to kind of pitch the book. I'm going to encourage listeners to pick up the book, in particular for that chapter, because we need more people to just recognize there is no religion gene. There is no proclivity towards religion. That's just not true. There's no empirical evidence to support that. It's a canard, right? It's just literally not true, and that chapter completely destroys that argument.
Fantastic. Now, if someone wants to interview you, like another podcaster, or have you come to a conference and give a talk, how can they reach you to get more information?
I'm easy to find on the internet. You can very easily just Google me, Ryan Cragun. My website, either ryancragun.com or Ryan T Cragun. I happen to own both of them.
Yeah.
You can find me. You can find my contact information there. There are a couple of other Ryan Craguns out there. One plays football for UCLA, so he occasionally takes the top spot in those Google results. But there's only one academic Ryan Cragun, so it's pretty easy to find me. But email me. I will always respond to emails. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Very good. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for coming and spending time with me here on the Phil Ferguson Show. And I'm assuming my listeners greatly appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Pace e lunga vita. Lunga vita e prosperità.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions. Thank you again for listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. I am delighted, absolutely delighted that you are here. Thank you so much for listening, and a thank you to everyone who has given 5-star reviews at some platform. The two that I know of are Apple Podcast and Stitcher. The show is hosted originally at Spreaker. And keep in mind, I hope, tell me if this is not true, the show has no ads other than the shameless self-promotional content that is Phil Ferguson and me promoting Polaris Financial Planning. Of course, this is part of how I make my living. And the nice thing about the show is that on a regular basis, I get to talk to my listeners almost every week, every 10 to 14 days sometimes, and tell them my thoughts and feelings on stuff, which saves me a lot of time and allows the business to be more efficient. So that is very cool. If you are looking for an advisor, you are free to email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. At this time in May of 23, my current minimum for new clients is $2 million of assets under management. Keep in mind that things like a house, cars, land, and anything in your 403B or 401k, pension, those don't count towards that $2 million minimum because I can't manage them. And in the case of 401ks and 403Bs and other accounts, I can't do it anyway because of the Department of Labor. We've talked about that. So anyway, the show's already well beyond 1 hour, so I'm going to wrap it up. If you have questions, concerns, want to be a client, of course, like I said, email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. And that's it for the show. I do hope to see you out there on the road somewhere soon. Until then, ciao.
Because you know I'm all about that grace, can't earn it. I'm all about that grace, God made it. I'm all about that grace, Holy Spirit. I'm all about that grace, Oh yeah, it's pretty clear, God should have loved you. Now we can worship like we're supposed to do. Cause I got that free gift that I can embrace. Not from my good works, but all from my faith, yeah. I read the Bible, y'all. It says that grace is free. You know this gift is real. It's love and mercy. God sure does love you, so praise him, y'all. Cause he died and rose again so you can worship him non-stop. Yeah, the Bible, it told me don't worry about your life. It says Christians, we like to walk by faith and not by sight. God knows that we are not perfect and he shows grace to us all. So I think that deserves praise, so join us and sing along. Because you know I'm all about that grace, can't earn it. I'm all about that grace, God made it. I'm all about that grace, Holy Spirit. I'm all about that grace, hey. Jesus is coming back. Go ahead and tell all the disciples that he stands and knocks. Raise your heart out. But I'm here to tell you, he died and rose again so you can worship him and stop. Yeah, the Bible, it told me don't worry about your life. It says Christians, we like to walk by faith and not by sight. God knows that we are not perfect and he shows grace to us all. So I think that deserves praise, so join us and sing along. Because you know I'm all about that grace, can't earn it. I'm all about that grace, God made it. I'm all about that grace, Holy Spirit. I'm all about that grace, because you know I'm all about that grace, can't earn it. I'm all about that grace, God made it. I'm all about that grace, Holy Spirit. I'm all about that grace, because you know I'm all about that grace, can't earn it. I'm all about that grace, God made it. I'm all about that grace, Holy Spirit. I'm all about that grace,
Yeah, that's right. We're all about that grace. Continental Breakfast coming at you. 2015, baby.